We were driving home from a wedding 3 hours away from our city. The night had been a beautiful celebration, full of laughter, dancing, and plenty of drinks. My boyfriend had stayed sober to drive us back, while I was admittedly tipsy and on the edge of passing out in the passenger seat. The route back was mostly dark country roads, long stretches of asphalt framed by endless fields and the occasional cluster of trees. It was late, and the only light came from the dim glow of our car's dashboard and the beam of our headlights cutting through the blackness. I was half dozing, lulled by the hum of the engine, the rhythmic bumps of the road, and the warm haze of alcohol. I don't remember the exact moment I first noticed it, but somewhere along that lonely stretch of road, a sudden brightness pierced through my half-closed eyes. At first, I thought it was just another car behind us, its high beams washing over the interior of our vehicle. The light felt overwhelming, almost unnatural in its intensity, but in my half-asleep state, I dismissed it as an annoyance. Then my boyfriend screamed. It wasn't a startled shout or a yell of frustration, it was primal. A deep, guttural scream that came from somewhere deep inside him, filled with pure terror. I've never heard anything like it before, and I hope I never do again. The car lurched violently to the right as he swerved off the road. I felt the tires skid, gravel spitting against the undercarriage as we narrowly avoided plunging into a ditch. My seatbelt dug into my shoulder as I was jerked upright, now fully awake and alarmed. What? What's happening? Are you okay? I stammered, my heart pounding as adrenaline kicked in. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He was trembling, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There was a truck, he managed to say, his voice shaky and hoarse. A huge truck. It came right at us. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Truck? I turned around in my seat and looked through the rear windshield. The road behind us was empty, completely and utterly empty. It was a long, straight stretch of asphalt with no intersections, no driveways, no streetlights, and no houses. Just darkness stretching as far as the eye could see. There were no taillights fading into the distance, no sign of movement, and no rumble of a massive vehicle retreating into the night. Are you sure? I asked hesitantly. There's nothing there. He was shaking his head, his eyes darting back and forth, scanning the road as if expecting the truck to reappear. I saw it, he insisted. It was huge, and it was coming right at us. I thought we were going to die. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had dozed off for a split second and dreamed it. Maybe his eyes had played tricks on him in the dim light. I even entertained the possibility that he'd had some kind of waking hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then I remembered the flood of light that had woken me up moments before, the brightness that had stung my eyes, making me squint in discomfort. I hadn't dreamed that, and it wasn't the kind of light our car's old, weak headlights could produce. We sat there for a few minutes, both of us trying to calm our racing hearts. The night was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Not even the sound of crickets or the distant rustle of wind. Just nothing. Eventually he started the car again and cautiously eased us back onto the road. The rest of the drive was tense, every shadow and flicker of light putting us on edge. Neither of us spoke much, each lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached home, he was still visibly shaken. Over the days and weeks that followed, I found myself replaying that moment in my mind, trying to piece together what had happened. My boyfriend remained adamant that he'd seen a massive truck barreling toward us, its headlights blazing, filling the road with light. But how could that be? On that narrow country road, there was no way a truck could have passed us without hitting our car or running us off completely. And there was no sound, no roar of an engine, no rumble of tires, no crunch of gravel under a vehicle's weight. I've tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an optical illusion, a reflection of light from some distant source, or even a vivid hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I'm not sure I believe those explanations. Sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet, I think about that night, about the light that wasn't there and the truck that couldn't be. And I wonder, was it just a trick of the mind? Or was it something else, something we aren't meant to understand? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I'll never forget the sound of my boyfriend's scream or the strange, unshakable sense of wrongness that filled the air that night on that dark country road. When I was younger, my family and I embarked on a road trip to Yellowstone National Park. If you've never been, I highly recommend it. It's a place of raw, untouched beauty. But before we could revel in the park's splendor, we had to endure the journey. And from our home in California, it was a grueling 17-hour drive. Our trusty Yukon XL became our second home during those days, as we spent hours on the road, breaking up the monotony by stopping at little motels along the way. We were behind schedule, though, and one night my dad decided to push through and drive straight through the night. He did his best, but by the wee hours of the morning, fatigue got the better of him. To keep us safe, he pulled off at a small, unlit rest stop in the middle of a dense forest. I couldn't tell you what state we were in. It was one of those flyover states, just another pin on the map of our road trip. My brothers and I had long since fallen asleep, lulled by the rhythm of the road, so the sudden stillness of the car parked in that lot barely registered. Sometime during the night, I stirred awake. The car was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face. My family was slumped in various uncomfortable positions, fast asleep. I wasn't scared at first, just disoriented and restless. I tried shifting around, hoping to get back to sleep, but it wasn't happening. The stiffness in my back and neck demanded I find a distraction. Looking out the window seemed like a good idea, even though the darkness beyond made it hard to see anything. Luckily, I'd packed a couple of flashlights for the trip. Quietly, trying not to disturb my family, I reached into the back seat, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a small yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest thing in the world, but it was enough to illuminate the immediate surroundings. I pressed the flashlight to the car window and flipped the switch, casting a faint beam of light into the inky blackness. At first, the view was unremarkable, a typical tree line, bushes, and the vague shapes of branches swaying in the cold night air. But then I noticed something unusual. Between two trees in the distance stood a dark shape. It was too upright and rigid to be part of the natural surroundings, and its outline vaguely resembled a man. It didn't move, though. It just stood there, still as a statue. I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it was just a bush or an odd tree trunk. But the longer I looked, the less convinced I became. Just as I was about to write it off and turn off the flashlight, the shape moved. It turned a full 90-degree pivot and disappeared behind one of the trees. The blood drained from my face. My heart raced as adrenaline surged through my body. My first instinct was to shut off the flashlight, plunging myself back into darkness. Then I threw my sweater over my head like a shield, as if that flimsy layer of cotton could protect me from whatever or whoever I'd just seen. I sat frozen in my seat, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining to hear any sound beyond the hum of my family's snores. I didn't dare move or peek out the window again. What if it was still out there? What if it had seen me? I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed curled up in a semi-fetal position, too terrified to even think about waking my parents or brothers. What could I say? That I'd seen a shadow in the woods? I was sure they'd brush it off or tell me I was imagining things. When the first rays of sunlight pierced the darkness, my fear began to ebb. The world outside transformed from a shadowy unknown to an ordinary rest stop surrounded by trees. When my dad started the car and we pulled back onto the road, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Exhausted from my sleepless night, I finally drifted off as the highway stretched out before us. But even as I slept, the memory of that shadowy figure lingered in the back of my mind. To this day, I've never told anyone in my family about that night. Maybe it was nothing, just a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me in the darkness. But deep down, I know what I saw. It wasn't the stunning geysers or majestic wildlife of Yellowstone that left the biggest impression on me during that trip. Instead, it was the figure in the woods, a shadow that remains etched in my memory, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't what you see in the daylight, but what you glimpse in the dead of night. Years ago, a friend and I decided to visit another mutual friend who was attending university in a quaint little college town. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a chance to reconnect, catch up, and experience campus life. We had detailed directions printed out. This was before GPS became a standard thing, and our friend had assured us the drive would take about 3 hours. We set off in the early afternoon, excited for the trip and chatting away as we drove. At first, everything was normal. The highways were clear and the directions seemed straightforward. But as the journey stretched on, we realized it was taking much longer than we expected. I don't remember the exact point at which the scenery began to change, but at some point, we found ourselves entering a dense forest. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees on either side that seemed to close in on us the further we drove. The sunlight dimmed, filtered through thick canopies of leaves, and the once busy roads turned eerily quiet. At first, it was charming, a picturesque detour through nature. But as the minutes turned into what felt like hours, the charm wore off. We seemed to be driving through those woods forever. The winding roads stretched endlessly, each curve revealing yet another stretch of trees and shadow. My friend checked the directions again. We hadn't missed any turns, we hadn't hit traffic, and apart from a brief stop at a gas station earlier, we hadn't lingered anywhere. Yet the clock told a different story. We were already past the 3-hour mark, and the woods showed no signs of ending. The further we went, the more unsettling it became. The air inside the car grew heavy, and the usual flow of conversation between us trickled to silence. There was no radio signal, and our phones were as useless as paperweights in this isolated stretch. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woods gave way to open fields and familiar sights. We rolled into the college town nearly 4.5 hours after we had left home. Exhausted but relieved, we shrugged off the odd delay. We didn't dwell on it. The excitement of seeing our friend and spending the weekend together quickly took over. The return trip, however, reignited the mystery. On our way back home, the journey took just over 3 hours, the exact time frame we had been promised originally. There were no dense woods, no interminable stretch of forested roads. It felt straightforward, uneventful, and baffling. The strangeness of the first trip didn't truly hit me until the next time I visited. On this second visit, I decided to pay closer attention, hoping to pinpoint where the detour into the woods might have occurred. But as I retraced our original route, following the same directions as before, the trip was a smooth, predictable 3 hours. There were no dense woods, no narrowing roads, and no eerie silence. The entire drive was as ordinary as it could be, with highways, small towns, and farmlands marking the way. I visited our friends several more times over the years, and not once did I encounter the endless stretch of forest again. To this day, I don't know what happened during that first trip. How did we lose so much time? Where exactly were we when driving through those woods? And why did that particular stretch of road never appear again? I've considered every logical explanation I could think of. Perhaps we made a wrong turn somewhere, or the directions had taken us on a longer scenic route that wasn't repeated later. But none of those answers fully satisfy the memory of those woods. Their oppressive silence, the way time seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the fact that no such road seemed to exist on subsequent trips. It's been years now, and the memory of that strange journey has faded slightly, but every so often it resurfaces in my mind. I still wonder, what really happened on that drive, and where were we when we passed through those endless, shadowy woods? Living in Northern California, I often make the trip down to Los Angeles to visit family. My usual route combines the 101 and the 5, a straight shot if I'm in a rush. But I've always been one to savor the journey, often setting aside a day or two extra to explore, take scenic detours, and enjoy the quirks of small-town California. That habit of taking my time has served me well, like the time my car broke down and I was beyond relieved I didn't have to scramble back to work the next day. One of my more memorable trips took me through Diablo County. I remember it vividly because of this enormous, absurd cow statue that loomed over the freeway. You couldn't miss it. Bright, gaudy, and completely out of place in the otherwise dusty, barren landscape. On that particular day, my boyfriend at the time and I decided to stop for food at the lone establishment in sight, a Denny's. The parking lot was oddly packed, with at least a dozen cars crammed into the spaces around the diner. This struck me as strange, given that the rest stop was practically in the middle of nowhere, just dusty hills and empty stretches of highway as far as the eye could see. Still, we shrugged it off, figuring it must be the only decent spot for miles. As soon as we stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. The hostess, who had been deep in conversation with a man near the entrance, immediately stopped talking and turned to look at us. Her expression was pure fury, her eyes narrowing as if we'd just committed some unthinkable offense by walking through the door. It wasn't the usual irritation you might encounter from someone having a bad day at work. This was something else, an anger so intense it made me want to turn around and leave. But before I could even process it, she snatched up 2 menus, her movements sharp and deliberate, and gestured for us to follow her. She led us through the diner, past at least 4 empty sections, before finally slapping the menus down on a table far from anyone else. Without a word, she turned and stormed off. My boyfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us wondering what we'd done to provoke such hostility. What made it even stranger was the emptiness of the diner. Despite the packed parking lot, I couldn't see another soul inside. No other customers, no sounds of clinking silverware or casual chatter, just an eerie stillness. The service we received after that initial encounter was flawless, quick, efficient, and oddly quiet. The hostess returned to take our order, her earlier anger replaced with a polite but distant demeanor. It was as if the entire bizarre moment at the door had never happened. As we ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The empty diner, the inexplicable hostility, the strange isolation of the place, it all felt surreal. I kept glancing around, expecting to see other diners emerge from some hidden section or workers bustling around in the background, but there was nothing. When we finished our meal, we paid and left without incident. Back outside, the sight of the crowded parking lot added another layer of confusion. Where were all the people? If there weren't other diners inside, where had all these cars come from? The barren landscape offered no answers. There wasn't another building in sight, just miles of dusty hills and that ridiculous cow statue in the distance. As we got back on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about the experience. The encounter wasn't exactly terrifying, but it was deeply unsettling. It felt like we'd stumbled into a place that didn't quite belong, where the rules of normalcy didn't fully apply. Even now, I find myself revisiting that moment in my mind. What was with the hostess's reaction? Why was the parking lot full when the diner was empty? And how could a tiny Denny's in the middle of nowhere feel so charged with an inexplicable sense of wrongness? I don't have any answers, just lingering questions and a vague unease whenever I pass through Diablo County. It wasn't the scariest experience of my life, but it's one I'll never forget. It was late in the evening, around our 10s. My mom and I boarded a coach to leave Ibiza. We were being shuttled to the airport, making stops along the way to pick up other passengers. At first, it seemed like any other departure, routine and uneventful. But as the journey progressed, a strange atmosphere settled over the coach. The driver seemed unusually tense, his body language tight, and his eyes darting to the mirrors more than necessary. He was driving faster than seemed safe, sticking almost exclusively to back roads. It wasn't long before we began noticing police checkpoints at junctions leading to other roads. Officers stood alert, their expressions serious, and their presence was unsettling. Above us, helicopters roared through the sky, their spotlights slicing through the darkness as they flew toward a nearby town. It was clear that something serious had happened, though no one on the coach seemed to know what. Whispers passed between passengers, theories forming, but the driver remained silent, focused solely on his task. The tension was palpable, like an invisible weight pressing down on everyone. The feeling didn't leave me even when we reached the airport. The eeriness followed us through security and into the plane. It lingered in my chest until we finally landed back home, where the familiar comfort of normalcy eased it away. To this day, I wonder what was happening that night in Ibiza. What event had caused such an atmosphere of urgency and unease? The second unsettling experience occurred during a visit to family in Norfolk. One of my relatives' husbands was a gamekeeper for local farmers. In the evenings, he'd often take me along to teach me how to shoot with his high-powered air rifles, the kind that require a license. It was a fascinating and thrilling experience, a mix of skill and discipline. One night, after a long session, we packed up and began the drive back. The countryside was pitch black, the kind of darkness where the only light came from our headlights slicing through the night. At first, the drive was quiet, but I noticed something odd. He kept checking his mirrors. At every turn, his eyes darted to the rearview mirror, scanning for something I couldn't see. His usual calm demeanor had shifted, replaced by an air of watchfulness. After a while, he turned off the main road and took a detour. For about 10 minutes, we navigated winding roads through the countryside, his eyes constantly flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors. I didn't ask questions. I could sense it wasn't the right time, but my curiosity was mounting. Eventually, we pulled up to a friend's house. We went inside, exchanged pleasantries, and stayed just long enough for the tension to break. When we left, it wasn't the same way we'd come in. Instead, he took a completely different route back. I never found out what had prompted his behavior that night. Was it a precaution, something he had seen or sensed? Or was it just an overabundance of caution from someone used to navigating the isolated and often unpredictable rural areas? The experience left me with a lingering feeling of unease. It was a reminder of how quickly the ordinary can shift into the uncanny, where the familiar becomes fraught with tension and unanswered questions. Both journeys, one in Ibiza, the other in Norfolk, taught me that even the simplest trips can be tinged with mystery, leaving you wondering long after they're over. Back in 2011, my sister made a baffling decision that would set the stage for one of the most grueling experiences of my life. Out of all the colleges in California, she chose Southern Arkansas University in Magnolia, Arkansas. To this day, I can't understand why. Maybe it was the affordability or some inexplicable pull she felt toward that small-town school. Regardless of the reason, her choice set a chain of events into motion that none of us could have predicted. Even stranger than her choice of college was my mom's insistence that we drive her there. With nothing substantial to move, I argued that flying made far more sense. My sister could buy whatever she needed once she arrived. My main concern, however, wasn't the logistics. It was the timing. It was the middle of January. While California's winter was mild, I knew the same couldn't be said for the states we'd be traveling through. But as usual, my logic didn't win out. A week later, I found myself crammed into a car with my sister, mom, and grandpa, embarking on what would soon become the road trip from hell. The journey was manageable at first, though tensions were already running high. Long hours in a packed car with little to do made for short tempers. But everything took a sharp turn when we reached the Dallas area. Out of nowhere, a vicious winter storm slammed into the region. The temperatures plummeted, snow blanketed the roads, and icy conditions turned the highways into skating rinks. We pressed on, thinking we could outrun the worst of it. That plan fell apart as we approached a small town called Mount Pleasant, Texas. The snow and ice became too treacherous to navigate, and my mom, panicked and unsure of what to do, pulled over near an exit ramp. That's when the car's front tires slid into a snowdrift. We were stuck. For 20 agonizing minutes, we pushed and heaved, our shoes slipping on the icy ground, until we managed to free the car. We pulled into a nearby gas station, only to find it closed. To make matters worse, the car's heater chose that exact moment to stop working. The four of us huddled in the freezing vehicle, our breath visible in the air, trying to conserve body heat. After what felt like an eternity, about 4 hours, the gas station owner arrived. The gas station owner turned out to be our saving grace. Not only did he let us inside to warm up, but he also offered us coffee and food, a small mercy that felt monumental in our desperate state. He warned us against continuing our journey, explaining that conditions were even worse further north. After some debate, we made the tough decision to turn back and return to California. While the decision to head home seemed like the safest choice, it didn't mean the journey back would be easy. The long hours on the road started to take a toll on my grandfather, who was in his early 70s. We hadn't realized it at the time, but he was in the early stages of dementia. The first sign of trouble came at a rest stop in New Mexico. We had stopped for a quick break, but when it was time to leave, my grandpa was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as we searched the area, calling his name and scouring the parking lot. After 45 minutes of frantic searching in the biting cold, I found him standing next to an idling semi-truck, shivering. The driver had been kind enough to let him warm up, but the incident left us shaken. The rest of the trip home was uneventful, but overshadowed by the physical and emotional toll of what we'd been through. When we finally pulled into our driveway in California, we were exhausted, freezing, and utterly defeated. The trip had tested our patience, our resilience, and even our family dynamics. Looking back, that ill-fated journey was a lesson in planning, preparedness, and most importantly, listening to your gut when it's telling you something is a bad idea. It took me years to shake the experience. For a long time, I refused to leave the state, not even for short trips to nearby places like Las Vegas. Though the ordeal is behind me now, the memories remain vivid, a reminder of how quickly a simple road trip can spiral into chaos. And as for my sister, she never ended up attending Southern Arkansas University. When I was about 24, I set out on a road trip with my two best friends, cruising down the breathtaking Pacific Coast Highway in California. It was one of those golden adventures you dream of in your early 20s. Freedom, friendship, and the open road. We had the perfect soundtrack blasting, snacks piled high, and miles of coastal beauty stretching ahead of us. At one point in the evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the horizon in shades of orange and pink, we stopped for gas at a small, nondescript station. While refueling, I noticed a guy in Army combat uniforms, ACUs, sitting on the side of the road with backpack and a sign. He was hitchhiking. As an Army veteran myself, my heart immediately went out to him. I couldn't help but feel a kinship with someone I assumed had shared similar experiences. But my friends weren't as easily convinced. I managed to talk them into it, though, with a plan that sounded sensible at the time. I'd approach him first, verify that he was a veteran, and make sure he wasn't dangerous before offering him a ride. Of course, plans rarely go the way you expect. I pulled over and barely had the car in park before the guy took matters into his own hands. He opened the hatchback, tossed his pack inside, and climbed into the back seat before I could even get around the car to speak to him. My friends, wide-eyed, exchanged glances. We'd already divided up pocket knives and pepper spray among ourselves, ready to defend our lives if necessary. It was a mix of adrenaline and sheer disbelief that kept us from reacting immediately. The hitchhiker, who introduced himself as Flowers, was around our age, mid-20s, and let's just say not exactly what we were expecting. It became obvious fairly quickly that he was not a veteran. He was also high as a kite. Despite his somewhat sketchy appearance, he turned out to be pretty mellow, even friendly. That didn't make us any less uneasy, especially when he casually lit up a joint in the car without asking. None of us were comfortable with that, though he did generously offer to share. The real kicker? Flowers didn't actually have a destination. His plan was simple: south. Unfortunately for us, we still had about 7 hours of driving ahead, and the idea of his vague destination didn't sit well. I was behind the wheel, trying to focus on the road, while my friends texted furiously back and forth, strategizing how to get him out of the car without creating a scene. After about an hour of nerve-wracking tension, I decided we needed to act. I spotted a random restaurant in the middle of Big Sur, a small, quiet place with just enough activity to make it seem like a plausible stop, and pulled in. "Isn't Heather supposed to meet us here?" I asked, throwing out a name that none of us knew, but hoped would sound believable. My friends, catching on immediately, chimed in with enthusiasm. "Oh yeah, Heather, she said she'd be here by now." We all got out of the car, Flowers included, and while he was distracted, we discreetly unloaded his backpack from the trunk. As soon as his belongings were on the ground and we were safely back inside, I started the engine and we sped off. My heart raced as the restaurant disappeared in the rearview mirror. Looking back, I know how incredibly lucky we were that nothing went wrong. Flowers didn't lash out or cause a scene, and for all his quirks, he seemed harmless. Still, the reality of what we'd done hit me hard as the adrenaline wore off. We had picked up a total stranger in the dark, isolated on a long stretch of highway. It could have ended very differently. Later, when we stopped for the night, we found his hitchhiking sign in the back seat, a simple cardboard piece with the word South scrawled in big letters. I kept it, a small but significant reminder of the lessons learned on that trip. It's been 4 years since that night, and the sign still sits in my closet as a testament to one truth. Some risks just aren't worth taking. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, and I never will. But that experience remains etched in my memory, a story we still laugh about, nervously, whenever we reminisce about that wild road trip down the Pacific Coast Highway. Many years ago, a close friend and I decided to visit a mutual friend at her university for the weekend. Excited for a fun getaway, we meticulously planned the trip, armed with detailed directions from our friend, who assured us the drive would take about 3 hours. We set off with the kind of carefree enthusiasm that comes with road trips in your youth. The sky was clear, the roads smooth, and our spirits high as we chatted and laughed, eager to reach our destination. At first, the drive seemed to go as planned. The directions were spot on, and the scenery was exactly what we expected. Open stretches of highway, small towns, and a few rolling hills. But then, something changed. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it started, but at some point, we found ourselves entering a dense, shadowy forest. The trees loomed high above us, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that cast the road in a dim, almost eerie twilight. The woods were thick and seemingly endless, the kind that feel untouched by time. We kept driving, expecting to emerge from the forest after a few miles, but it stretched on and on. The road twisted and turned with no landmarks or signs to indicate where we were. We weren't lost. Our directions didn't suggest we had taken a wrong turn, but the woods felt like they had no end. By the time we finally emerged from the forest, we realized something was off. It had been over 4 hours since we left home, and we were still miles from the university. The trip was supposed to take 3 hours total, yet here we were, well past the time frame with no explanation for the delay. When we finally arrived at our friend's college town, exhausted and bewildered, the clock showed 4.5 hours since we'd started. We were late, but the relief of seeing our friend and settling in for the weekend quickly erased the strangeness of the drive. The woods became an afterthought as we dove into the fun and laughter of the reunion. It wasn't until the drive home that the weirdness resurfaced. The return trip took just over 3 hours, exactly as our friend had initially predicted. My companion and I exchanged puzzled glances, but shrugged it off. Maybe we had misjudged the timing on the way there, or perhaps it had simply felt longer because of our excitement and anticipation. Months later, I made another trip to visit our friend. This time, I was determined to figure out what had happened during that first drive. I followed the exact same directions, paying close attention to every turn and stretch of road. But no matter how carefully I looked, the long path through the woods was nowhere to be found. The trip was uneventful, taking just about 3 hours. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. On subsequent visits, I retraced the same route over and over, always hoping to spot those mysterious woods again. But they never appeared. There was no dense forest, no endless winding roads, no shadowy canopy. It was as if that entire stretch of the journey had vanished. Even years later, I can't explain it. There were no detours, no road closures, and nothing to suggest we had veered off course that first time. Yet somehow, we spent an extra hour and a half driving through a place that, by all accounts, doesn't seem to exist. To this day, I wonder where we really were during those missing hours. Was it just a trick of memory? A strange detour we failed to notice? Or was it something more inexplicable, like slipping into another place for a brief moment in time? I'll never know, but the mystery of the vanishing woods lingers in my mind, a haunting reminder of a journey that defies explanation. The summer after high school graduation was a time of freedom and excitement for my friends and me. We decided to make it memorable by embarking on a road trip with a twist. We were going to stay in haunted places. As someone fascinated by the paranormal but lacking any personal ghostly encounters, I was thrilled. Armed with a copy of Haunted Texas, we planned our first stop, a charming, historic bed and breakfast with a reputation for ghostly happenings. The B&B was everything we hoped for: creaky floors, dim lighting, antique furnishings, and an eerie air of history. We spent hours exploring, sneaking into every unlocked room and whispering excitedly about the possibility of spotting a ghost. As dusk fell, we ventured out for dinner, returning late into the night when the house was silent and its other guests presumably fast asleep. It didn't take long for our curiosity to get the better of us. Armed with shiny new digital cameras, state-of-the-art at the time, we headed downstairs to the main area. We wanted to test our luck, snapping photos in hopes of capturing an orb, shadow, or any sign of the supernatural. The air was thick with both excitement and nervous giggles as we crept around, whispering about the spooky stories we had read. That's when we heard it. The doorknob on the front door rattled, its metallic jiggling unmistakable. We froze, our cameras momentarily forgotten, and turned toward the door. The knob twisted, turned back, then jiggled again. Someone was trying to get in. Is that one of the other guests? One of us whispered nervously. We waited, expecting to hear the creak of the door opening or to see someone step inside. But the door didn't move. The rattling stopped, and the room fell silent once more. We exchanged uneasy glances. Were we about to be caught sneaking around in the middle of the night? It wasn't like we were doing anything wrong, but the idea of explaining to some late-arriving guest, or worse, the owners, that we were ghost hunting felt mortifying. The door remained firmly shut. We hadn't heard the sound of anyone walking away, and the large glass outer door, visible through the window, hadn't moved. Trying to shrug it off, we reassured ourselves that it was nothing unusual. Maybe the wind, maybe someone had jiggled it and realized they were at the wrong house. Our initial excitement for ghost hunting waned after that. A chill lingered in the air, and the fun had shifted to unease. Not long after, we decided to call it a night and retreated upstairs to our room. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old house sounded amplified in the stillness of the night. Shadows seemed darker, and the air felt heavier. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The next day, bright sunlight poured through the windows, and the house seemed much less sinister. We were ready to leave and head to SeaWorld, eager for a day of carefree fun. As we left, we exited through the same front door from the night before. That's when we noticed something that made our stomachs sink. The wooden front door was protected by a heavy glass storm door. It creaked loudly when opened, and when it closed, it slammed with a sharp, unmistakable sound. We stared at each other, the realization dawning in silence. The glass door hadn't moved the night before. We hadn't heard its telltale creak or slam when we watched the doorknob rattle. Whoever or whatever had been trying to open the door couldn't have been a person. We didn't linger to discuss it. Instead, we shared a series of wide-eyed glances and piled into the car. Weird, someone finally muttered, and that was the extent of our conversation about it. None of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. The rest of the trip was uneventful, save for a few orbs in our photos and the occasional creepy story we told ourselves to keep the mood alive. But the memory of that doorknob stayed with me long after. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night at the B&B. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the mind. Or maybe it was something beyond explanation. A small brush with the paranormal in the quiet stillness of that haunted house. One thing is certain. That summer road trip left me with a story I'll never forget. In 2005, my wife, Susan, and I, along with another couple, embarked on an exciting road trip through Scandinavia. Our journey was a carefully planned mix of scenic drives and cultural exploration. The itinerary had us flying into Helsinki, Finland, before taking a ferry to Stockholm, Sweden, driving to Gothenburg, and then ferrying to Denmark to complete our trip. The first leg of our journey started smoothly. We drove westward from Helsinki for about 100 miles, the roads stretching through lush green landscapes and picturesque countryside. Eventually, we arrived at Fiskars, a quaint village known for its beautifully restored 17th century foundry and artisan shops. Nestled among the verdant forests and serene streams, the village exuded charm, beckoning us to stop and explore. I parked our car at the top of a small embankment overlooking the village, and we spent the next hour wandering through cobblestone streets, admiring the craft shops and historical architecture. The air was crisp, the atmosphere serene, and it felt like time had slowed down. When it was time to leave, we walked back to the car, still basking in the idyllic experience of Fiskars. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and stepped down on what I thought was the brake. To my horror, I had mistakenly pressed the clutch. The car, instead of stopping, began to roll forward toward the embankment's edge. The next few seconds felt like slow motion. Susan and our friends screamed as the car edged closer to the drop. My friend, in a reflexive and futile attempt to brace himself, grabbed at the car ceiling. My mind raced with the terrifying prospect of the car tumbling front first over the edge and landing on its roof. Then something miraculous happened. The car stopped abruptly, its two front wheels suspended in midair. Dazed and shaken, we realized that a large rock, placed to reinforce the embankment wall, had come loose and wedged itself under the car, halting our descent. Carefully, we all exited the vehicle, one by one, holding our breath, as if any sudden movement might upset the car's precarious balance. Once we were safely out, we stood a few feet away, marveling at our incredible luck while contemplating the car's unlikely position. Recognizing the need for help, we walked to the Fiskars factory store nearby. The store manager quickly grasped the gravity of our predicament. He needed only to step outside to see the car teetering over the edge. Without hesitation, he began making phone calls. Unfortunately, Finland's Auto Association was tied up with a major accident, and their assistance wasn't immediately available. Unfazed, the manager reached out to the town's engineering department. Within an hour, a local truck driver arrived to assess the situation. However, after examining the car's precarious position, he realized he couldn't handle the task alone. Determined to help, he returned with reinforcements: a second driver and a forklift. The operation to rescue the car was nothing short of dramatic. With the forklift maneuvered carefully from the front, the team worked to lift the car and align it with the rear wheels, inching it back to its original parking spot. All the while, we held our breath, watching every movement like spectators at a high-stakes performance. Finally, the car was back on solid ground. Miraculously, when the undercarriage was inspected, not a single scratch or dent was found. The relief we felt was immeasurable, and we couldn't thank our Finnish rescuers enough. We offered them a reward for their efforts, but they firmly declined, their warm smiles and friendly waves reminding us of the genuine kindness of strangers. As we drove away from Fiskars, this time with someone else behind the wheel, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the situation. What had started as a serene day in a picturesque village had turned to an unforgettable adventure, one that we would recount for years to come.